Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Kyle King. I'm the Managing Director of Capacity Building International, and thank you once again for joining us for another webinar in our 2021 webinar series on international models and emergency management, brought to you by collaboration between TIEMS, the International Emergency Management Society, and Capacity Building International, and sponsored by the Institute for Security Governance. And today, we're going to have a pretty unique presentation, I think, when we discuss South Africa. So we are joined today by Roman Tandlich, the TIEMS Regional Director for Africa, and he'll give us his bio here shortly as we begin the presentation. And I'm very much looking forward to this sort of unique point of view and presentation. And of course, as always, we're joined by Harold Drager, President of TIEMS. Harold, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I also look forward for this.
Good. I guess as far as opening remarks, we're going to go through our normal sort of administrative procedures, and then Harold, I'll turn it back over to you. But of course, we are now 16 to 25 of our scheduled events for this year. We have now nearly 1,300 attendees in our webinar events so far, representing over 66 nations. So that's something we're very proud of. And just a few quick points as we get started. So of course, let us know where you're joining from. We see a lot of familiar faces and names and things like that in our webinar series, but let us know where you're joining us from. And you can do that via the chat. And as always, if you have any questions or anything else like that, you can use the Q&A feature, because that allows us to actually, document the questions for later on in case we basically are not able to answer your questions during the webinar live. Then we will be posting them inside of the LinkedIn event page, which is now here. So the event information and everything that we're doing throughout this entire series is on the LinkedIn event page, and all the information is there. If you're not there already, you can join the page and join the event. You can follow CBI and TIEMS, and especially ISG, and stay up to date on social media. But you'll join about 317 now, I think is our total count, emergency managers from around the world. And there we post, continuous updates about the webinar series. We post the PDFs, the slides, links to the recordings, and then also any questions that we might have not been able to answer. We try and address those later on and post them into the event page itself. So go ahead and head over there and join that if you haven't done that already. Now, future webinars. So today, as we already know, we're covering South Africa. Next will be Germany, Norway. The Future of Emergency Management series will be continuing with the University of Manchester, and we'll go into the smart cities, impetus project, and data science and COVID response will be coming up as well as we round out the series for the rest of this year. And now I will just, before I hand it over to you, Roman, Harold, I think you had a couple of comments you wanted to say.
Thank you, Kyle, for the introduction. And yes, I'm very hello, everybody, wherever you are. And I look forward for listening to Roman. I was in South Africa in 2019, but no, I will get more information from Roman. We have now covered the corners of the world by Australia, now South Africa, we have China, we have had different in Europe, and we still are missing some in South America. So if we have listeners from South America, just tell us and we will put you on. And another thing, when I sent out the message to you, I also included my report for last year. And please read it and see what benefit it is to become a member in TIEMS. And please join us. And also, we have the annual conference in December in Paris. There's still time to either submit an abstract for a peer review paper end of this month, or practitioners' talks, which you can do all the way up to end of September. We'd like you all to join us also there. So with those words, I look forward to listen to Roman.
Thank you very much, Kyle and Harald, for the introductions. So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, wherever you might be. There is a lot of nice presentations to follow. I have to admit that the ones that I did have a chance to participate in were very interesting. And I'll try to touch base on the system for disaster management, because I think from South African point of view, it is a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit more holistic. And I will then point out where the disaster management system, or disaster risk management system rather, overlaps with the emergency one along the way. So my background is not very complicated. I'm still in academia at the Rhodes University, based mainly in health sciences, as you can see. My background originally is in biotechnology and microbiology, and I stumbled into, so to speak, into emergencies and disaster management through the fact that some of the challenges that we face in South Africa to this day cannot be addressed using standard procedures, such as procurement and mechanisms in local government, and I will try to point these out. And when some of the research I've done on water and sanitation ended up running into implementation problems, I turned into searching for solutions, and that's how, together with a lot of collaborators, who I will try to mention as much as possible, we bumped into disaster management and then solution to complex emergencies and so on. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of background. South Africa has a total population of the estimate in 2016. We had the last census of the population in 2011. Today, there is a next one underway, but we sit somewhere between 55 and 60 million inhabitants. The growth rate is not the highest on the continent, but is relatively steady at around 1.2% per year. The country has reached medium development, medium level of human development, and it is characterized as an upper middle income country, but still from a viewpoint of sciences such as sociology, it is a semi-peripheral country, which means that a lot of the destiny and factors that control the development in South Africa are subject to outside forces, but also a lot of the parameters that control disasters, regional or continental in nature, and I will try to point these out as we go along. Okay, so in addition to this particular challenge of level of development being medium, and thus sometimes resource shortages cause problems in response to emergencies and disasters, South Africa also suffers from high degree of inequality, which can be characterized by the Gini coefficient. This is a parameter that back in 2011 indicated that South Africa was one of the most unequal societies in the world. So one of the most unequal societies in the world, and this was mainly based on the income distribution. A lot of it is historic, where large parts of the South African populations were marginalized and often cornered into Bantustans and homelands and parts of the territory which were then occupied by the white minority, resulted in uneven distribution of wealth, land, and other resources, which I will touch on later on. Now, unemployment remains high. The latest figure which we got this week, it's about 35% when you count people that are actively looking for work, people that have not looked for work for some time. If you include them in the productive age, you come up to a percentage of 43%, which means that resources and vulnerability of the population are high. Public health and disaster management are often affect the profile. In the case of South Africa, and this is where my interlink with disaster and emergency management is also highly centered, is that there's a very strong health element to a lot of the disaster profiles that we will be talking about. Now, disaster risk management is often limited at the local government level, and I will touch base on this, which means that the immediate response to the disasters becomes a problem when shortage of resources and technical capacity can be encountered at the local government level. In the understanding of my research, and also in the understanding of the teaching that I do in disaster management with final year students, and also with the work that we do, we generally adhere to the WHO definition of disasters, and this is that it is an occurrence, whether natural, man-made, or complex, which is disrupting the normal conditions of existence and causes levels of suffering that exceed the capacity for adjustment at the local, provincial, or national level. A lot of the debate in Southern Africa in the field of emergency, disaster, and disaster risk management is still philosophical in nature, and that is that disaster management is still on the books, which means that it is the wording which is used in the legislation, and it is also still used in many cases where the approach to dealing with outcomes of emergencies and disasters is reactionary in place. However, the legislation, as you will see, and also the integrated nature of the system, which is multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary, and multi-stakeholder on both the capacity, administrative, organizational, and operational planning capacity, is actually integrated, which means that the system in itself is disaster risk in nature, and which means that it is focused on disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, thus mitigating the potential impact of hazards, whether they are man-made or natural or complex in origin. Now, we basically try to look at in the understanding in and management, the system is very much focused on minimizing disaster risk. And in the context of South Africa, we are exposed to a whole range of disaster hazards. They are natural, man-made, and also complex or zoonotic in nature. Now, the ones that are most commonly found from the natural side are floods, droughts, tornadoes, fires. Some of them can be man-made, but many of them are natural. And then also we have epidemics. These are outbreaks of things like viruses, viral diseases. I'll mention a few of them. What is very, very historically significant when it comes to me entering the sphere of emergency and disaster management, but also due to the challenges that local government faces and also disaster management officials face in South Africa, are often the complex disasters where the trigger can be a human activity, but the hazard is natural in origin. One of the examples you see here is an informal settlement where you can see shacks on top of each other and very densely populated areas that are very close to rivers. And often these settlements are built in the vicinity or just under the flood line. And thus, many times when there are storm surges and impacts of climate change cause unpredictable weather patterns, rainfall and flooding are often a result. And thus, most vulnerable people, many times either low income segments of the South African population, or even in places like Johannesburg and Cape Town, these are immigrant communities where refugees from other countries enter South Africa, whether legally or illegally, can then be the cause for the impact of disasters being very local, but at the same time being devastating, because many times the resources that entire families or communities have are wiped away. Another example, this is we saw on Kyle's initial slide the picture of one of the bays in Cape Town, which is one of the most touristically attractive spot on earth. It is among the top 10 destinations for celebrities and regular folk to come and have a holiday. Right across that bay that you saw is a town called Hout Bay, which is one of the outlying originally fishing communities. And today it is very commonly seen as densely populated areas on the hillside, and in the vicinity of them are fire hazards. So this also points to another hazard and disasters that can occur. And many times what happens is that these fires are triggered by man-made action, but because of the vicinity to either slopey areas or vicinity of urban settlements that are highly populated in density, this results in devastating fires. Now, this is a building at the University of Cape Town. This is one of the most iconic libraries called the Jagger Library, which was recently also subjected to and completely burned down due to one of the fires that happened there. So as you can see, the outcomes are quite complex and also quite devastating. And many times what happens is that at the local level, their devastation is wiping out an entire existence or an entire resource, which will then not be available to the community. From the man-made disasters, there are three important things to keep in track. Traffic accidents are very important. The death rates from traffic accidents is one of the highest in the world. And then related outbreaks of wash-related diseases are important because of the fact that urban development is often uncontrolled, and low-income settlements lead to the development of settlements which are not serviced by either water or sanitation supplies, and this can then lead to outbreaks of preventable diseases. Now, finally, to touch base on what are the hazards, the natural hazards, we can look at a map. This is a map of precipitation distribution across the territory of South Africa. Darker blue ranges here indicate areas where the precipitation is very high. So you can see that the eastern, mostly Indian Ocean coast of South Africa, Rhodes University is related and located somewhere here. The precipitation level is relatively high, above the world average of about 890 millimeters. So it's about 1,000 millimeters. So precipitation is not a problem, but the further you go inland, the drier the areas become, and thus parts of the region, especially the provinces of the Northern Cape and also parts around Cape Town, are highly arid. This uneven distribution of the precipitation causes problems with drought, and also it could be potentially a limiting factor on sectors of the economy such as agriculture. One of the ways that South Africa has mitigated this is the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, where Lesotho, which is an enclave inside South Africa, you can see it here, completely surrounded by the South African territory, but rich in water resources. There was a set of dams which was built since 1986, and currently water is ferried by gravity and by other means down from the Lesotho Highlands down to South Africa and then distributed pretty much across the entire country. Mitigating the impacts of drought and managing this is one of the complex natures and implications for the disaster management in South Africa. We are also under influence of El Nino and La Nina. For example, the area where I'm from, which is Rhodes University, we haven't had proper rain since 2015. So the last 6 years, we have been in drought. We are naturally a semi-arid area, but a water scarce area rather. But due to the fact that the Lesotho Highlands Water Project ferries water to us, we still have some sort of normalcy existing. Okay, finally, I will touch on floods. Flooding is quite common in South Africa. About 83% was the annual probability a couple of years ago. And one of the most devastating floods occurred in 1994 in Laingsburg, which also triggered the current setup of the disaster risk management system. Now, droughts, I've talked about this a little bit more. What made headlines a couple of years ago was again the city of Cape Town, where a population of about 5 million people almost completely ran out of water, and mitigation measures started being put in place, such as water restrictions, which are not unique to South Africa. There are many other countries, like, for example, parts of Australia, parts of California, that suffer from this. But what happened was that this was one of the first times that a highly populated, densely populated urban area with millions of people was about to run out of water completely. And mitigation measures that have been put in place then indicate that going forward with climate change and the severity is a very important consideration for South Africa and for disaster management systems in the country. Okay, I'm going to skip through this. So I've talked about the understanding of risk. Now, in South Africa, this is a common representation, the simplified and classical representation of disaster management cycle. In the system that I will talk about just now, all 4 phases of the disaster management cycle are taken care of and should ideally be capacitated both on the human resource, technical and logistical side inside all levels of government, whether local, provincial, or national. Now, the disaster management system itself is integrated, which means that disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management plans are requirement by law at all levels of government, whether we're talking about a small local municipality or whether we're talking about central organ of state, such as, for example, the Department of Defense. Now, at the same time, because of the history of part of the disaster vulnerability and emergencies that we deal with in the health sector, still has to do with the unequal distribution of resources throughout the apartheid and colonial past of South Africa, which is why the disaster management system, because it deals with the most vulnerable state of human populations, should be accountable to all levels of society. Now, the legislation itself that governs the disaster risk management and indirectly also emergencies is the Disaster Management Act of 2002, which has been amended in 2015, partly in response to Hyogo and Sendai frameworks and the transition from one to the other. And then at the local government level, and also at the level of operationalizing the legislation, the Disaster Management Framework of 2005 then provides key areas of performance and indicators whether the commitments of government that are legislated are actually being met. Competencies are then mirrored by the framework and also by capacity required from the legislation. When we look at the system itself at the national level of government, the central organ of state that looks after disaster management is the NDMC, or the National Disaster Management Center, which receives recommendation drafts, policies, and passes them on to stakeholders. These are governmental and non-governmental stakeholders, pretty much everyone who has any interest in disaster management or emergency management in the country. And the forum that is actually legislated and also one of the ways that South Africa articulates it, that in the very essence, and at the most fundamental level, the disaster management system in the country follows the principle of participatory approach to disaster management. NDMAF is the National Disaster Management Advisory Forum, where stakeholders from government departments, unions, business, NGOs, and so on sit regularly or should sit regularly and discuss inputs on challenges in the disaster management and emergency management space that the country is facing, South Africa is facing, and also provide input on legislation, which then goes to the relevant government clusters, such as the security cluster, social cluster, health cluster, and so on. And ultimately, at the interministerial level, there is a body called the Interministerial Committee on Disaster Management, which has been in place since the late 1990s when the Green Paper on Disaster Management was published. And this is a committee which does occur and exist on an ad hoc level and should actually coordinate at the government level and take decisions. It has now, in the context of the coronavirus, been replaced by a structure that I will talk about just now. And then ultimately, what I'm trying to say with this is that the flow of information between the government, the stakeholders, and other stakeholders at the government level should provide a cycle where all the voices are heard and the participatory approach to disaster legislation and the system itself can be as comprehensive and pick up as many issues as possible, and also maintain the response in all stages of the disaster management cycle so that the impact on the population of any disaster hazards or disasters themselves is minimized. In addition to what you saw there, the other principle is that at the central level, this National Disaster Management Center has counterparts at the provincial level through the provincial disaster management centers, which are in all 9 provinces of South Africa, and then also at the level of local government through either local disaster management centers at the district level or municipal disaster management committees or centers at the metropolitan and the local municipal level. Now, what has been recently very important is that the idea is that there should be bidirectional flow of information from the national to the provincial to the local level at the side of the governmental structures that deal with disaster management. And then also there should be a link to sub-municipal structures and even ward level, where councillors and also communities or NGOs should be able to provide feedback and collect data and be able to feed these up and down the chain of command, so to speak, so that any voice that needs to be heard in the system is actually heard. Currently, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2 sections of the Disaster Management Act of 2002 that actually are the most fundamental to declaring and managing a disaster at the national government level are sections 26 and 27, which basically state that the central government is in charge of responding to a disaster and managing it. And in the context of that, the Interministerial Committee on Disaster Management has pretty much been replaced by a structure called the National Coronavirus Command Council, which contains representatives from pretty much all government departments at the central level, which are involved in responding to coronavirus, and has a very strong implications in that it contains very strong focus on the military and security cluster providing, so police, army, and so on, and intelligence services providing input on how to deal with the pandemic. Now, Disaster Management Center is the central organ of state. It basically executes the activities, and it also manages communication and data collection, recovery of budgets, and so on, manages and handles budgeting should a disaster strike, and when the disaster is then declared at the local, provincial, or national level, the financial instruments to help deal with the disaster are managed through NDMC and also through its counterparts at the other levels of government. Now, databases that are managed by the National Disaster Management Center include Feldfire indices. Feldfire is basically a bushfire. That's a term that is often used in places like Australia. In South Africa, it is called a Feldfire. It also manages the Flash Flood Index, which was designed in collaboration between NDMC and the South African Weather Service, which is the National Weather Bureau. This was back in about, I think, 2011 to 2015. Then there was a National Register of Disasters, and ultimately the idea is that this data should be made publicly available. This has historically been a challenge in certain areas. Now, the Interministerial Committee I've talked about, so just to make one point, the NDMC is a central organ of state, and it forms part of the Ministry of Local Government and Traditional Affairs, which means that in the context of the current pandemic, the minister responsible for local government and traditional affairs actually issues regulations that then have the force of law. And also the problem here is that the minister itself is not in the center of political power, which can sometimes cause challenges. And it also provides a little bit of a double perception among the population that there are two centers of power, one being the state president, where pretty much the center of executive power rests, and then the Minister for Local Government, which is a relatively not central ministry in itself, and all of a sudden has been perpetuated into the center of public attention. I have to also say that currently under the coronavirus is the first time that the National Disaster Management Act of 2002, which has by many countries been followed as a template to use to derive their legislation between 2002 and today. This is the first time that many parts of the South African population actually become aware of the legislation. And there was some discontent with, for example, the way that lockdowns were handled. And that's why there is currently an amendment bill up for public comment where the law will be updated again. Provincial Disaster Management Center and municipal structures mirror what the National Disaster Management Center does at the central government level, and they do this inside their jurisdiction, which is either the local or the provincial jurisdiction in place. Now, execution, ward structures, this has become very important mainly because it is the link between the government and the community. Many municipalities have recently, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, started using ward disaster management, where they actually use these links between ward structures such as councillors and local government representatives in the community to collect up-to-date data about impacts of disasters, vulnerability, and also collect data on potential resilience and resources that communities already have in place so that they can withstand impacts of disasters that are quite common using their own knowledge. This has been actually quite a strong focus of the research that at least myself has been involved in the last couple of years on the local levels of resilience and defining what the skills and resources actually are that the community can use at their level of existence, and also that they can share with the government themselves to improve resilience themselves. Okay, Disaster Management Advisory Forum. I've spoken about this already. I'm just going to stress one point here, and that is the multi-stakeholder, the nature of the of this crisis management platform. Crisis management, I understand, has by other speakers in this seminar series already been talked about in different ways. However, what is unique about this particular structure is that it provides complete inclusiveness of all the stakeholders, and theoretically speaking, at least, it should be the structure that should make sure that all the voices in disaster and emergency management are actually heard. It is operational for the most part at the national and provincial levels of government in South Africa, and has been a struggle to get it up and running at the local government level. Now, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic has been that joint operations committees, or JOCs, at the local government level and district level of government have provided an opportunity to functionalize these. And many municipalities, I know of one or two from the Western Cape that we work with, where some of our students are doing some postgraduate studies, that accountability links and these JOCs have actually become very strongly integrated, and many stakeholders which were originally not part of these structures have been brought on board even to run them in some instances. So this capacity has been strengthened. Many times, however, what happens at the local government level is that the disaster management advisory fora are not carrying out only this function, but they are integrated with other structures, for example, fire protection fora and so on, because there is not enough capacity to simply dedicate them to disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. Now, memberships are appointed generally by the head of the Provincial Disaster Management Center or the National Disaster Management Center. At the same time, what is important here is that the advisory fora have a form of an assemblage where basically all stakeholders at the table are equal, and their voices should theoretically, at least in many cases, this is actually how it's executed, are equal in strength, which means that the agency, the human agency that then carry out the various activities inside the disaster management cycle, these are provided there. These are done comprehensively and are done with all the expertise that is necessary, carried out as efficiently as possible. This is especially important, and this is why the disaster management advisory fora are so important, is because they provide for the ability to mobilize resources and execute disaster management and disaster risk reduction activities in low resource settings, which is often the case, especially at the local government level in South Africa. Now, NGOs and volunteers play a critical role in the disaster and emergency management in South Africa. The reason why that is because often they are the ones that contain the most up-to-date information on the local government level, and also because there is a ability often and critical technical expertise present inside NGOs, which the local governments struggle to procure. At the local government level, in many areas of South Africa, the municipalities are failing in the basic provision of services such as water, sanitation, and especially in the Eastern Cape and many other water scarce areas around the country, there has often been some of the NGOs that I will mention on the next couple of slides have actually come in to drill boreholes, for example, to provide water to drought-stricken communities. And this has been done outside of the framework of government. And many times NGO in the region of the Southern African subcontinent actually provide expertise and resources which the local governments struggle to get for whatever reason. Now, NGOs help with firefighting, waste management, drinking water prevention, and drought management. The ones that are the most important is Gift of the Givers and Al-Imdad. Al-Imdad is the one that's locally anchored inside the area where I'm based, but Gift of the Givers is the one that provides most operations nationally and internationally. They have also been involved in providing drought relief, but also negotiated the release of many hostages from Al-Qaeda on the African continent. Further indications are the South African Red Cross and its affiliates, which are also important across the provinces. Some examples, many cities have developed various models of provision of disaster management services to their communities. This has, for example, been the node system, which was focusing on the warehousing on critical supplies. This is mostly done in the Western Cape province around Cape Town and inland from there. This is the most developed system in South Africa per se, and integration is done on the set of storing samples and resources at sites which are most likely to be exposed to disasters from a particular hazard, mostly natural hazards. And at the same time, there is a lot of investment in training volunteers and NGOs. and service command posts are localized so that decentralized action can be done by first responders as close to the onset of the disaster as temporarily possible. At the same time, what has started happening is at many government levels is that call center and data from these nodes of communication links is being digitized and linked to GIS systems to provide up-to-date profiles of disasters in terms of hazards, risk, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity at local government level. Cape Town and Western Cape Province, which is the southwestern part of South Africa, are leading the country in this particular aspect. Cape Town itself has a central command center. There are volunteer units which are in place, which means that the National Disaster Management Center structures are perfectly replicated at the metropolitan level. The Disaster Management Center is fully functional. It is integrated with the Disaster Management Advisory Forum, and then also the volunteer units, which means local communities are recruited and equipped to provide assistance and be trained with skills that can help in improving community resilience and also maintaining strategic links to the provincial and national level. Now, academic institutions are a major part of the system. They provide research into components of disaster risk policy and related matters. They provide and facilitate capacity building from the local and disaster management fraternity levels. There are various of them. The most developed one is the African Center for Disaster Studies, which is located at the Northwest University in Potchefstroom. This is in the central part of the country, in the Northwest Province. Then radar is and mostly what the center does, it provides education at the postgraduate level, so anything after a bachelor's degree and up. Radar, which is a similar program, this is located at Stellenbosch University in the Western Cape Province. And then in the northeastern part is the University of Venda, which has recently launched a bachelor program in disaster management. And then in the southern African part of the country, where I am based, there is Stendon, South Africa, which provides Bachelor of Business Administration with focus on disaster risk relief. My institution provides expertise in mostly postgraduate studies in the areas of resilience and in the areas of studying the adaptive capacity of communities. So we are talking mostly about research in the areas of health promotion, sanitation, education, and also we call it resilience mainly because that is a transboundary notion which has been around way before disaster risk management fraternity started investigating this notion. Now, finally, I will mention the MISA, which is the Disaster Management Institute of Southern Africa. This is a professional body which regulates the profession in the Southern African context and mainly in South Africa itself. What it does are various things. Number one, it provides a platform for certification, which is similar to what TIEMS has launched internationally as the TQC platform. What they do in 2016, the MISA put in place a professionalization of the degree and professionalization of the profession of disaster risk managers, where they offer 4 levels of certification based on either experience for a certain level or amount of number of years that a particular person has been practicing. Secondly, based on recognition of qualifications, and then also based on providing seminars and annual conferences to allow for the practitioners in the field to develop their skills further. Now, at the same time, the MISA organizes fora where the government officials and stakeholders interact with each other and where they basically provide input into policy and best practices going forward. In South Africa, health is a major part of disaster risk reduction. And currently what is actually being made clear by the COVID pandemic is that the integration of health into disaster risk management must be improved. One of the examples that I'm going to give are the migratory patterns of the workforce, where eastern part of the country where I'm based to the western part of the country, laborers migrate on a semi-annual basis. where people from rural parts of South Africa, which are relatively low income, such as the Eastern Cape, where Rhodes University is based, move to the western part, southwestern part in the surroundings of Cape Town, where where economic activity is booming. With them, they bring certain increase in, for example, nematode infections. Now, is this a disaster? Normally not so much, but because there is an impact on the health system in the Western Cape, this kind of consideration must be improved. Next thing is transmission of diseases. Consumption of contaminated drinking water must be improved and put in place and raised an awareness about in the context of disaster risk management in South Africa, because many municipalities now have become disaster zones. We have even had towns where the sewage treatment plants have been so dilapidated that they have actually become islands and they are surrounded by lakes of sewage. Now, is this a disaster management problem? Normally not. It would only be in the destruction of infrastructure in the immediate aftermath of, for example, earthquakes or floods. But because it is occurring on such a scale and because a large percentage of the wastewater treatment plants and drinking water provision infrastructure around South Africa are dilapidated, it has become a disaster management issue. In addition to this, what is important is malaria, which is endemic to South Africa, mainly to the northeastern part of it. But because we have a large mobility of people across the sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa must have monitoring in place and deal with this on an annual basis pretty much. What is also important is that the northernmost part of the South African is impacted by malaria. And what is problematic about it is that for the past several decades, this number of deaths from malaria have not gone down. Today, we also face another public health issue, which is becoming disaster management in nature, and that is the co-pandemics of malaria and HIV. Okay, I will then just go to the WASH. I've talked about this, and I will finish with the one thing which is very important for us in South Africa, and that is HIV and AIDS. Besides the pandemic of COVID-19, South Africa has been experiencing a pandemic already since the 1980s, early 1990s, and that was HIV and AIDS. We have one of the largest ARV dispensing schemes on earth, with 7.4 million people having either HIV or AIDS, and then also receiving ARVs to a large extent. What is important about this is that the COVID-19 exposed how vital it is to maintain provision of services such as dispensing of medication against HIV and AIDS during a lockdown, to finding alternative mechanisms which would normally be in the mandate of healthcare professionals, but which have clearly had an impact on disaster management systems due to the fact that if HIV and AIDS patients are cut off from their medication, it has knock-on effects. It increases morbidities and mortalities. It increases chances of co-infection with, for example, tuberculosis. So the pandemic itself is redefining the realm of disaster risk management in South Africa. And because of the unpredictable nature of risk society that we find ourselves in the context of the 21st century, it also is a source of potential emergencies, which we will need to be aware of going forward. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, Roman, thank you very much for that presentation. Very comprehensive. We do have a couple of questions for you. So first of all, I have a lot of questions, but we'll answer the ones from the from the attendees first. Can you describe your system for regular preparedness improvements, such as exercises, engagement of private subjects in those exercises, evaluation, certification, if any, financing, those kind of issues?
Thank you. That's a good point. So drills do occur at localized level. There are also, it depends, the preparedness drills vary quite substantially across the territory of the country. In the context of fires, for example, the legislation, for example, deals with veld fires or bushfires quite extensively, and that is that there are volunteer volunteer fire brigades across many of the high-risk areas that are either arid or that suffer from annual occurrences of bushfires. For example, Western Cape, so southeastern and southwestern part of the country would be a good example. In addition to that, what is often in place in South Africa is that government sets up organizations that improve preparedness, or improve resilience of socio-ecological systems, for example, against fire, where organizations such as Working for Fire, which are semi-governmental, work on increasing awareness, working with communities to improve firefighting skills, but also who work on monitoring the size of vegetation, for example, from alien vegetation, which is more prone to catching fire and causing felt fires that are large scale. And then also what is important, for example, the counterpart on the water side that I am working with mostly, not with the counterpart, but the area of water science, is that there is Working for Water, which has for a long time worked on removing alien vegetation and help manage the water flow so that water scarcity and drought, their impacts on the socio-ecological systems are decreased. At the same time, there are municipalities, for example, Cape Town and Western Cape are very good example of that, where disaster management system, and especially the volunteer units where members of the community become part of the disaster management system themselves, are often trained and they have drills in performing basic functions that they are tasked with. Awareness campaigns, I would say across the entire country, is the most important part of improving resilience, but also research into, for example, the resources at local government level and community level has gained traction in the recent years. And those are the things that I would mention. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So next question is, how is it with the emergency supplies in case of disaster? Who is responsible, and how are the government private reserves planned, controlled, and maintained, and are distributed? And I know you mentioned the node system that you have in some municipalities and some localities. Can you expand upon that very briefly?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good point. So we had a presentation several months ago in Finland, where the local resilience, for example, evacuation shelters were decentralized and pretty much mandated at the, for example, block of flats level. Okay, in the context of resources themselves, the municipality is mandated by law to provide certain basic services, so free water, free sanitation, free electricity. That is often not being carried out, and often the challenges are that the either the people are not documented who would qualify to receive basic services free of charge, or the rate of urban development and the uncontrollable nature of local low-income settlements, which we call townships or locations in South Africa. Not to be derogatory, it's just that they pop up so often that it is, and so quickly, that it is very common that you have a well-serviced area and right across the road you would have a surface area that has no services at all. In the context of the financing, the budget and the awarding of funds in response to disasters is managed by the NDMC. And at the same time, there are provisions in legislation that govern finances at the local government level that can allow reprioritization of funds if a disaster requires funding to be made available quickly. Most well-developed systems contain shelters, where, for example, in Cape Town, you have annual rains around this time. We have winter between June to August, and many parts of the Cape Town metropolitan area flood, which is where resources such as shelters for emergency shelters are already in place and they are being utilized. At the same time, at the local government level, based on the hazard register and vulnerability register of the population, many disaster management structures, for example, would have firefighting equipment, emergency provisions and food parcels and things like that. But because some of them, sometimes municipalities are in disarray, resources at the local level become a problem. I would leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We do have a few questions left, but we are currently running just a little bit short on time, and I know we're a bit pressed for time, Roman. So I want to thank you very much for your presentation today. We will be sending you the remainder of the questions if you don't mind drafting out a short answer for us, and we'll post that into the event group on LinkedIn so that people can have the answers to their questions. And of course, I wanted to continue and say that we do have additional professional development opportunities for those that are interested, and that includes, of course, what Roman had already mentioned with the TQC and TQAC certifications that are available through the International Emergency Management Society, and of course, the certification for individual emergency managers with a nationally recognized professional certification, and or other individuals with documented competent experience for the TQC, and of course, the TQAC for others as well with a different level of experience. Now, those objectives, of course, are the sharing of best practices, promoting global competence in emergency management, and supporting international collaboration, which is a large portion about why this webinar series even exists. If you want more information, head over to TIEMS.info and find out some more information about the certification programs. In addition, if you're interested in getting certified in NATO crisis management disaster response and finding out more about, say, for example, what is the thought process and systems behind managing a crisis and what NATO does internally as far as their staffing procedures to handle things like what we've unfortunately seen very recently in Kabul, then that's where you'll want to find out how NATO thinks and the way that they operate and the way that they respond to these types of events. So you'll find out more information about that. There's the link below. It is the NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response course at the University of California, Irvine. Course starts on September 20th. So go ahead and enroll if you're interested in that. And of course, to acknowledge our sponsors for the webinar series, which is the Institute of Security Governance. And if you have any information about or have any questions about the Institute for Security Governance and what they do in terms of emergency management and resilience, you can then reach out to Mr. Scott Moreland or Ashley Woodson over at nps.edu, and they'll be able to answer your questions. And of course, you can head over to the Institute for Security Governance.org if you'd like to find out more information. And with that, I would just like to say thank you very much for attending another webinar. And Harold, I'll turn it over to you for closing remarks.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, I like to stress one point I mentioned before, because I do see the importance of these webinars, that we can present different systems from all over the world. I would really like to see some universities take up this issue and have some of their students or professors or whatever look into the differences and how can we use these differences in order to improve the systems all over. You see what South Africa was facing, quite different from the industrialized countries. So I think I will again urge those who have power to do that, please use this information. It's all out there. So I hope someone will. And thank you, Roman, for presenting South Africa.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you in our next webinar.
Same to all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.